My name's Benedict Cumberbatch, and I'm going to take you back in time. Imagine driving around London's West End in the 40s and 50s. You'd almost certainly have seen billboards advertising the plays of Terence Rattigan, the master of the well-crafted play, of upper-class manners and forbidden sexuality, a lost world of reticence and repression. Just over a year ago, I was asked to take part in a revival of a Rattigan play after the dance, and I had some preconceived ideas that gave me cause for trepidation, as well as the usual actor-lead concerns about, oh, a bit typecast for me, you know, class-wise, it's a bit upper middle class, that's stuff I want to get away from. But I think I had fears of him as a writer of not having any relevance in the 21st century. I was worried about why do this play now, but by experiencing an audience reaction to it, which varied both in demographic and age remarkably for what you'd imagine a Rattigan audience to be comprised of, it just showed how universal his appeal was. I found myself at the start of a huge upsurge of interest in Rattigan, and now, in his centenary year, it seems that people can't get enough of him all over again. But Rattigan himself remains an enigmatic figure, a troubled homosexual with a gift for commercial theatre, who yearned to be taken seriously as a playwright, but who always felt an outsider. So who was Terence Rattigan, and what does he still have to say to us today? As one of the highlights of Rattigan's centenary, his play Cause Célèbre is being performed here at the Old Vic. It's the story of an upper-class woman who has a scandalous affair with the young chauffeur she employs.
Let me take your cap.
Thank you, miss.
By the way, it's Mrs. Mrs. 3 times over, as it happens.
God. Divorced?
Yes, once. Other one died. And now 7 years gone with old rats. Mr. Rattenbury, my present one. I'm giving things away, aren't I?
The director of this production is a friend of mine, Thea Shurrock, who also directed me in After the Dance last year. I asked her what she thought Rattigan's appeal is today. When we first talked about After the Dance, I was reticent, very irritatingly, I remember.
Do you mean when you said no?
Yeah, when I said no. Well, I think this prejudice. What would the sympathies be for these characters in this sort of pretty privileged world just between the wars? How is a modern audience going to be drawn into this?
Well, isn't it that essentially, although the characters that he often writes about, and After the Dance is a very good example of that, are of a very small slither of society. Yeah. What he is really interested in is what it is that drives us, what it is that makes our hearts ache, what it is that makes us laugh, what it is that makes us feel happy and take pleasure in other people, and how we have an amazing capacity to hurt other people. He always said, this is the class that I come from, and he wrote about those people because he understood them better. But you don't have to be a member of the class to understand it. No. And that, I think, is what's so brilliant about his writing, and why he's been so misunderstood for so long, because people like you have made that mistake of going, well, you know, isn't it only that he writes about a certain type of person for a certain type of person? And the answer is no, he doesn't at all.
Terence Rattigan, like me, was educated at Harrow Public School, a place that seems to have played an early role in nurturing his interest in theatre and playwriting. And perhaps my prejudice of his limited appeal came from my introduction to him whilst in this privileged bubble of private school education. Not that Harrow is particularly associated with theatre. Many former prime ministers, statesmen, even royalty have passed through its doors, as well as the odd commoner like me. Rattigan was at Harrow 65 years before me, but in many ways the school hasn't changed that much. Well, at least to look at. Harrow is a boarding school, and there are several houses where the boys live during term time. I was at one called the Park, which was also Rattigan's old house. On speech day every summer term,
we would all be called together for the annual house photograph.
1991, summer 91, autumn 19 when I arrived. Yeah, that's me. I had to double check. Blonde hair, you see. Proof that I was once blonde. And look at those huge hands. Wicketkeeper's hands, I think, which is what I ended up being. It's the first year, so I got up to 95. And then, in the middle of my hair getting worse. 94, so 95 is the last year. There we are. I think I'm wearing my Rattigan Society tie. So many, many, many ties to remember. That one was purple with white rats on it. It was our theatre-going society tie, named in honour of the great man himself. And terrible centre parting, replete with curtains. It's strange being here. It's wonderful, but it's like one of the lyrics in one of the Harrow songs. Your heart will thrill at the thought of the hill, and it's very true. You get a rush of memories. I wonder what Rattigan felt like at the same time. Let's see if we can find him. Now, where is he? It starts in 1927. Where is he? Rattigan. There. Gosh. Very stern, very severe centre parting as well. This is the second year, 28. God, you can pick him out very easily, right along the end here. And he's already got some kind of piping on a blazer, which I presume is a sports colour. So he's already achieving something in the world of sports. And then 29, then he's in his full flannels, and that would be for cricket. A high achiever and a very dapper dresser at a very young age.
He certainly looked the part, but in reality, without his scholarship, he wouldn't have made it to Harrow at all. Rattigan was born into a civil service family in Kensington, London in 1911. His father, Frank, was a diplomat, and from the age of 2, Terence spent much of his time with his grandmother, whilst his parents lived a glamorous life overseas. But in 1922, following a row with the Foreign Secretary, his father was forced to retire on a small pension. It was a huge humiliation. But by winning the scholarship to Harrow, his son Terence could still have the opportunity to follow in his father's footsteps into the diplomatic service. But young Terence Rattigan's main passion was for drama.
The first dramatic criticism I ever received came from a master at Harrow, and was scrawled rather angrily in red ink across the top of a one-page playlet in French, which I, with the rest of a very junior class, had been set to compose during prep. It ran, French execrable, theatre sense first class. I was awarded 2 marks out of 10.
The school library, called the Vaughan, had a large collection of plays to keep the budding playwright inspired.
Rattigan spent hours here in the Vaughan Library poring over classical texts as well as modern playwrights, Galsworthy, another Altarovian, Barry, Pinero. I think his interest was sparked mainly by Coke Norris, a very dry classics teacher who was teaching him Aeschylus' The Agamemnon. In class it was a very arduous exercise, but he came to read the play here and was just blown away by its sheer power and emotion.
Whereas his classics teacher had treated the Greek story of Agamemnon purely as an exercise in translation, Rattigan read it as it was meant to be read, as a powerful drama.
Do you see those who sit before the house, children like the shapes of dreams, children who seem to have been killed by their kinsfolk, filling their hands with meat, flesh of themselves, guts and entrails, handfuls of lament, clear what they hold, the same their father tasted. It's hard to see how that kind of passion could be made dry in a classics classroom. Or is it?
Your heart's desires be with you.
Rattigan would soon become a central figure in the theatre life of the school.
Frank Rattigan encouraged his son's playwriting, but only as a hobby. It wasn't looked upon as something to be taken seriously as a profession. I think a lot of parents who send their children to a place like Harrow or Eton expect their sons to
either follow in their footsteps if they are like Frank Rattigan was in the diplomatic corps, or perhaps medicine or the law. It's something watching this schoolboy rehearsal of As You Like It that resonates with me. Both my parents are actors and wanted me to do anything but become an actor. But unfortunately the bug bit quite early, and involving myself in productions like this where I played Rosalind when I was all of 14. I tried to persuade them that it was a good enough profession for me, and thank God Rattigan did the same.
I was told that you couldn't make a living out of playwriting. You couldn't make a living out of any kind of writing except possibly journalism. And I wouldn't have been trained for that. And I remember the argument endlessly used by my father, "You can do it in your spare time, old boy." But of course, I later discovered this absolute nonsense. You can't write in your spare time.
Martin Tyrrell, who teaches English and drama studies at Harrow, directed me in my early days on the school stage, and it was he who introduced me to Rattigan's work.
What in particular do you think Rattigan drew on from his time here, from the people and environs of the school?
I certainly think he would have found the community very exciting, almost like a kind of soap opera with mini tragedies playing out, and he would have seen the marriages of some of the school teachers teetering on the brink. He would have seen all the politics that makes for a boarding school education, and hierarchies, and the drama of adolescent friendship and sudden enmities. It would really have been an extremely good training for a playwright, I think.
While at Harrow, I was fortunate enough to play many roles, but one of the most memorable experiences was that of playing Arthur Crocker Harris in the Browning version, one of Rattigan's best-known plays. It's set in a boys' public school. Crocker Harris is thought to be based on Rattigan's classics tutor, Coke Norris. A failed teacher, he's being forced into early retirement, while at home his unfaithful wife describes him as dead.
Wilson?
Sir?
You were late for chapel this morning. I have therefore submitted your name as an absentee.
I wasn't really late, sir. Only a few seconds, sir. I was in the library and you can't hear the bell.
You will no doubt recount those excuses to your housemaster, Wilson. I fear I am not interested in them.
The austere, deliberately off-putting Crocker Harris, the man who knows that he is a failure, has projected this image which has earned him the sobriquet of the Himmler of the lower fifth.
That's right.
Sir, I thought this might interest you.
What is it?
Verse translation of the Agamemnon, the Browning version.
And then there's this marvellous moment when Taplow gives him the Browning version of the Agamemnon.
False, I agree, but... Well, I think you will enjoy it more when you get used to the meter he employs.
Oh, but it's for you, sir.
For me?
Yes, sir. I've written in it.
Crocker Harris is moved to tears. It really strikes a chord that there are
Instant
this
humanisation of someone.
And also the stiff upper lip, which has been stiff and upper for so long, being allowed a moment of trembling. Yes.
Rattigan's straitened family circumstances gave him the sense of not really belonging at the school. Public schools in Rattigan's day could be brutal places where you could easily be made to feel the outsider. But he avoided being a target for bullying or exclusion, largely due to his brilliance on the cricket field. He was an excellent batsman and opened against Eton in the annual games at Lord's. But it wasn't just Rattigan's social standing which made him feel an outsider, but also his sexuality. It was probably in these formative years that Rattigan would have realized he was homosexual. At the time, homosexuality was illegal and viewed as completely unnatural.
He would have felt under great pressure to conform to gender expectations and social expectations. He must have felt this wrench within him. That's why his plays, of course, are, you know, like cowards, full of figures who are tortured by their sexuality.
In 1930, Rattigan won a scholarship to Trinity College, Oxford, to read history.
I didn't want particularly to take a degree. I wasn't going to do any work. I was determined about that. I was going to write plays or write something. I did very little work, and I spent most of the time either going to plays at Oxford or coming up to see plays in London, or occasionally performing excruciatingly badly, and once or twice writing, but usually obscene sketches.
Whilst there, Rattigan worked on a play called First Episode, which focused on the experiences of a group of university friends. With a small inheritance, Rattigan put up money towards the opening of First Episode in an experimental theatre in Kew. It then moved into the West End. Rattigan felt he had made it as a playwright and decided to quit Oxford. But after a couple of months, the play closed and Rattigan found himself broke. Humiliated, he had to move back in with his parents. And for the next couple of years, he continued to try and prove himself as a playwright, but had constant rejections. Then in October 1936, his luck changed. A major show at the Criterion Theatre had unexpectedly flopped. The management needed a cheap production to put on for a 6-week gap until the next play was ready. Rattigan's rejected comedy, French Without Tears, was offered the slot. French Without Tears tells the story of 5 students at a residential language school in France, when a beautiful man-hunting young woman, Diana, is introduced into their midst. It was later turned into a Hollywood film, starring Ray Milland and Ellen Drew.
I do love you, Ellen.
In it, Rattigan explores unreciprocated love, but to comic effect.
Say that again, blast you. Say that again.
I do love you.
No. No. French! Bill! Bill, I'm starting for London tomorrow. Never leave me alone with that girl until I'm safely on the train. Promise? I promise. I promise.
Before the opening night, Rattigan was a bundle of nerves. Finding the right actors for this production hadn't been easy. Some of the tryouts had been a disaster. The dress rehearsal itself was also pretty spectacularly awful. So he paced the streets of London and went for a haircut, a thing that was to become a ritual for him on first nights. He then went with his family to a restaurant. They had a meal and drank a bottle of champagne. And then in the glum atmosphere that followed, his mother, Vera, began another first night ritual. She took the cork from the bottle and put it in her handbag as good luck.
And with an inexperienced cast, Rattigan was going to need all the help he could get.
They were all unknowns. We had to cast it in a second, I mean, over a weekend. Every sign pointed to disaster.
When they turned up at the theatre, the family found a very ill-tempered audience. It was a wet June night. Most of them had struggled through a very busy West End. There were other openings, a Marlene Dietrich film, for example. The first 20 minutes of the play went very, very quickly. The actors were incredibly nervous. Harold French, the director, cowered in his box with fear that it was all going to run away from them. But eventually, they found their feet, and the audience were completely beguiled by the magic charms of the play. And at the end, after many cries of "Author, author," Harold French went to the back of the theatre and found Rattigan pressed against the wall, green with nerves, and eventually persuaded to drag him onto the stage, where he took his acclaim.
The first night success of French Without Tears was confirmed. The theatre was packed with delighted audiences every night. The play ran for more than 1,000 performances. This huge commercial success launched Rattigan's career as a playwright. He now had money and fame.
After the success of French Without Tears, Rattigan embarked on a riotous round of drinking, parties, gambling, and a slew of affairs with attractive young men. all this living the high life didn't inspire any new work, and whether it was simply that or a writer's block, it would be a couple of years before Rattigan would attempt to write another play. When he did, it would turn out to be a far more serious drama.
After the Dance is set in 1938, but looks at the 1920s generation of bright young things who, although no longer bright or young, insist on partying, just like in the good old days.
Have a good mind to slap you. Very hard indeed.
Go on, slap away and I'll slap back.
At the centre of this world is the hard-drinking historian David Scott Fowler. Joan, his wife, is unable to tell David the true depth of her feelings for him, even though earlier that day she has discovered he is in love with someone else.
Well, I'm glad that we never made the mistake of falling in love with each other. Sometimes I think perhaps ours is the best basis of all for marriage.
Perhaps it is.
It's worked for us, hasn't it?
It might have worked even better if we'd fallen in love with each other like you and Helen.
That's something different altogether. I'm not even sure that I like Helen as a person. Not in the way I like you. I don't know that I love her. That's something I can't explain.
Unable to face her husband leaving, Joan commits suicide by jumping from the balcony of their flat. Rattigan's theme here of unequal feelings within relationships returns many times in his work. When rehearsing and performing David Scott Fowler at the National last year, one of the discoveries was how the intensity of this drama was amplified by the detailed stage directions.
Rattigan is a joy to perform. He's a very actor-friendly writer. It's very clear in the structure of his plays what the character's emotional arc is over the course of the evening, and nowhere is that more in evidence than in his stage directions, which can be sublimely subtle. It can be a turn of the head, it can be the taking up of a cigarette, the changing of a record, all of which speak for unspoken emotions and words and thoughts. And I wanted to share one with you that happens at the end of After the Dance. In the previous act, David Scott Fowler's wife, Joan, has committed suicide by throwing herself off the balcony. And this last scene, David's left alone on stage. David goes to the window, hesitates a moment, and then steps out onto the balcony. As if making a terrific effort, he slowly leans over and looks down. He stays in that position for a few seconds and then steps back into the room, closing the window after him. That, for me, said everything in that moment about what David Scott Fowler understood to be his fault, the death of his wife, and how he was coming to terms with the reality of what she'd done by looking over that balcony and facing his own future of a pretty certain death through going back to the bottle. It's amazing stuff.
After the Dance first opened in June 1939, but war was looming. Audiences dropped off and the play had to close after just 6 weeks, and until our recent production was rather a forgotten play. I've come to the British Library, where many of Rattigan's letters and manuscripts are kept. His biographer, Michael Darlow, knows this material intimately. I asked him what happened to Rattigan when After the Dance closed unexpectedly early.
After the Dance, he got what in effect was a writer's block, which he actually later himself described as a nervous breakdown. And he really couldn't write. And he consulted this psychiatrist who advised him to get into the services and see some active service.
Following the outbreak of war, there was a huge surge of volunteers wanting to join up and fight Hitler. Rattigan wanted to join the RAF, but the competition was fierce.
He wouldn't have got into the Air Force, but the interview board, suddenly one of them said, "Oh, you're the chap who wrote French Without Tears." And so he got accepted for the Air Force.
Boy, I mean, thanks very much, sir.
And he then launched into his training as an officer, air gunner, radio operator. And he writes this letter fairly early in his training to his father and describes the huge concentration required to remember all the drills, all the knobs you have to turn to get the radio equipment to work properly, and how it demands such total concentration that keeping your head. Suddenly, he was in a war, concentrating, having to stay alive, having a responsibility for other men. It transformed him. And the urge to write came back.
In 1941, whilst on a mission in West Africa, Rattigan started a new play, Flarepath. He carried the handwritten manuscript in his kit bag at all times, until one long, eventful flight to Freetown.
And on the way down, we were shot at on the way down, we were damaged, and one of the engines packed up, and it looked as if we weren't going to be able to make it. So we had to lighten the aircraft, and everybody's luggage had to go overboard. And my own kit bag was just poised on the point of going over, and when I suddenly delved into it and regarded it with enormous suspicion by the rest of the crew, I remember pulling the pages away from the hardback notebook and throwing the hardback, but keeping the paper. We arrived at Bathurst with 2 minutes fuel. We were really lucky to get down. And I was lucky to have a manuscript of a play.
The play features a group of airmen and their loved ones during the night and the following morning of a night bombing mission over Germany. It dealt with love, fear, bravery, and the emotional trauma of war, precisely catching the mood in Britain at that time. On seeing it, Winston Churchill apparently said it was a masterpiece of understatement. Rattigan later adapted it into the film Way to the Stars.
I know what you've come to tell me, Peter.
You do?
Yes, you see, he didn't ring up this evening. And I counted one plane missing when you came back over the town. Tell me just one thing. How much hope is there? I see. No hope at all.
Not very much, I'm afraid.
As well as Flarepath, many of Rattigan's dramas were turned into successful films, for which he wrote the screenplays. One of the most celebrated was The Winslow Boy, a play which opened in 1946, later made into a film by Anthony Asquith. Rattigan takes the real story of a naval cadet who is expelled from college for an alleged minor theft. It charts his father's determination to get him a fair trial. Rattigan champions the rights of the individual against the legal and political establishment. It was seen at the time as part of a post-war move to greater democracy.
Have you ever studied Magna Carta, sir? Not very closely, I'm afraid. Have you? Close enough to know there's a clause which states that no subject of the king may be condemned without a trial. My son, I presume, is a subject of the king. Certainly. And he has been condemned without a trial. From the purely civilian point of view, yes. And from a purely civilian point of view, I'm going to fight you, sir. And I'm going to win.
Writing for films was a lucrative business, and by the late 40s, Rattigan was one of the best-paid screenwriters in the world. His success brought him a lavish lifestyle, both in London and in the countryside. He bought himself a mansion near Ascot called Little Court. It would become famous for its weekend parties. The house has been restored to its former glory by the current owners. I'm meeting someone here who remembers those party days well and who hasn't been back since the 1950s.
Hello.
Hello.
Lovely to meet you. My name's Benedict.
Mine's Jean.
Lovely to meet you.
Jean Dorney, now known as Princess Jean Galitzine after marrying into Russian aristocracy, was a famous fashion model and met Rattigan at a party after the war. They became very close friends, and many, including Rattigan's mother, thought they might one day get married.